Please excuse me if I get a little bit lost. I'm feeding back a little bit, I think, but it sounds a bit ringy. But if I get a little bit lost, because the last 18 months I've been used to doing stuff on video and just reading my talk, whereas I don't like doing that when I'm sort of speaking in person. So if I get a bit lost, it's because I haven't done this since February last year. So, despite adapting to working from home, one thing I've really missed is just seeing people. Being together and meeting people. Little did I know, when I left work on the 12th of March 2020, that would be the last time ever, and I mean ever, that would be the last time ever I would see my whole team. Because even though we're getting back into the office, there will never be the whole team together again in the office, because that's not the way of work anymore. People will choose when they work from home or whether they work in the office. Times change. But most of us have that need to be with others, to have that interaction with people, and people all around us, that physical interaction. In the middle of last month, I read something that made me consider in particular about God's presence, and that's what I want to share about this morning, but also how we can see God's presence through the Bible, and how that changed over that time. As we look at the Bible, it's a story of God and His relationship with each one of us, and it's got many strands through it, whether it be love, forgiveness, community, but also His presence, how that weaves its way through the whole of the Bible. So what I want us to do is just go through some of these things and then perhaps see how that applies to us. And in the first instance, from the moment God created the world, God made His presence part of His story. You know, He created a perfect world in the Garden of Eden, a garden with a couple that He shared it with. There was God, Adam and Eve. It would be perfect communion together. And Genesis 3 verse 8 says that God walked in the garden, and I don't believe He walked on His own. Okay, it doesn't tell us specifically, but I believe He walked with Adam and Eve. They shared that time together. His presence is about relationship, being with people, being with His created. Eden was God's sanctuary, a place to be and to share with others. His presence was personal. It wasn't a tangible, physical thing. It was just Himself. Perfect presence in the Garden of Eden. But of course that relationship was spoiled. Adam and Eve decided to override God's instructions in pursuit of their own gain. And as a result, sin came into the world and separated mankind from God. And from then on, thousands of years went on, and God and human beings, mankind's relationship was at arm's length. That's how it happened, because this barrier had been formed. God had promised Abraham that his people, that they would be a great nation. But for various reasons, they found themselves in enemy territory in Egypt. But God used a series of 10 supernatural events, plagues, it says that they call them in the Bible, to rescue them. And He extracted hundreds of thousands of people out of the country in search of a new promised land. And the journey was uncharted territory, but He led them by pillars of cloud and fire. His presence continued to be with them. Exodus chapter 13, verses 21 to 22 says, "By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left His presence in front of by night left His place in front of the people." God's presence had changed from relationship, and now it is about guidance, leading people on, leading them and taking them into the next stage of their journey. So having left Egypt, the Israelites would wander around for 40 years before they reached the promised land. They were a nomadic people. So they would have their tents, they would get up and go as the pillar of cloud or fire led them. But then God tells Moses in Exodus chapter 25, verse 8, He says, "Then let them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Of course, the sanctuary, the presence of God, needed to be flexible because the people were moving all the time. So he gave instructions how to build this chest with poles in it to carry it, and what was it to be made of, and what was to be in it, etc., etc. And it was put inside a larger area called the tabernacle, and the tabernacle meant a place of residence. And therefore, this tabernacle, and in particular the Ark of the Covenant, as it was called, was a symbol of God's presence with his people. God's presence was now provision and protection. He provided food and drink for them every day. He provided safe passage. He would protect them from their enemies. And he would also sort of cause defeat of their enemies as well. In particular, you remember the story, some of you may know the story of Jericho, where they would walk round, and Joshua's there, and God instructed them to walk round with this, the picture's gone, the Ark of the Covenant. So with that, they would walk round, and once they'd done that so many times for 7 days, then the walls of that city of Jericho came crashing down. God protected and provided. Let's move on. As the Israelites settled in the new land, they became fragmented. And the people demanded from Samuel the prophet that they should have a king to look after them and oversee what was going on in the land. And the second of those kings was David. And David established that Jerusalem should be the capital. That should be the focal point and bring everyone together. And he brought the ark, which we just saw a minute ago, he brought that to Jerusalem. But there was no special place for it. And it was his son Solomon who established God's next place of residence. Solomon got planning permission from God to build the temple. The temple was a vast campus, and it included the National Bank, but at the epicenter was this building here, which was the Holy of Holies. A large, cube-shaped, imposing building. And in that place, that's where the ark was put, and that was where God's presence was going to be, God's dwelling place on earth. It was about obedience, though. Experiencing God's presence at the time was about doing what God had asked them to do. It was about obedience and routine and discipline. Because God was perceived as one as to be greatly feared, and they needed to do what they had to do. And as we go back to the picture of here, the priest would only meet with God, the high priest would only meet with God once a year as he came into the Holy of Holies. And the priest would offer sacrifice to God on behalf of the nation. It was the Israelites' place of worship, but born out of obedience to God. Despite God's presence, the Israelites continually turned away from God. And as a result, where they were living was conquered, they were taken captive, and the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. After 70 years, through Nehemiah's leadership, they went back to that place and they started rebuilding the city and the temple. But it was only a temporary job because things were about to change in a significant way. A Messiah was prophesied. Someone who would come and save them, who would restore the relationship between his people and God. A relationship that, as I said earlier, was spoiled since creation. That Messiah, who was Jesus, brought new teaching, new purpose, and most of all, new life. And it was through his act of selfless love and amazing grace by dying on the cross that all of the boundaries and all the restrictions and all of the legalities of meeting God, coming to him, were all lifted. What was seemingly a defeat became a victory over death. And as Jesus then returned to heaven, a new era of God's presence started. And that's in you and I. Something totally different. The old physical temple was no more, not needed. And because God's presence is now within each of us. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6 says this: "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit lives among you? God the Father, if you like, was the presence. The presence in the pillars, the ark, the temple. God's Son brought the restoration of that relationship, and now the third person of the Trinity, God the Holy Spirit, is now able to live in us because of what Jesus has done. A new temple was built, but not out of stone, but in the lives of each one of us. You remember Solomon's temple had restrictions and regulations? Well, the new temple had none of that. And there were two radical changes to this access to God. Firstly, it was open planned. You know, it's a temple without walls, a temple without restrictions. You know, we can speak to God at any time. And open access. There's unlimited access to God. It's not just the high priest or the leader of the church coming to God once a year. We have access to God at any time. And not just when we come into church, but at any time in our lives we have that access. Galatians 3:28 says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." The church houses God's presence, but it's not the building, it's a community of people. And dare I say it, you know, we don't say when we come into church, we come into God's presence as if God's presence is here and we're coming to it. When you and I come into church, we bring God's presence. It comes with us because each one of us is God's presence, and we bring God's presence into wherever we meet, whether it's a church building, whether it's a hall, whether it's on the fields, whatever it is. We bring God's presence. And God's presence, therefore, now is in the form of love and being community together. It's about the heart. We don't need to come into a building to experience God's presence, because we are God's presence all the time. And every part of our lives should be an act of worship, community, and witness for God. And the last part, of course, we've thought about God's presence all through the Bible, but ultimate experience of this is going to be an eternal temple. In Revelation 21, it tells us that one day there's going to be a new heaven and there will be a new earth. And in particular, verse 3 says, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them." Eden is restored, and the whole earth will be full of God's presence. Completeness and fullness. This is God's presence. And that will be the day ahead. But until that day, what difference does it make knowing that you have God's presence living in you? We've heard two people already this morning who have given testimony to that. The answer to that question is it should make all the difference. Knowing that God lives in you should make the difference in every single part of our lives. You know, wherever we go, He should be visible in what we say, what we do. Our lives should represent Him, being that ambassador for His values, being salt and light, being in communion with Him. Last week, if you were here, Peter Blanche was sharing about the fact that one thing he learned from the church here was being love and sharing with others. And therefore, when he went to his modelling club, Leslie? Yeah, when he went to his modelling club, he shared that, God's presence with him, and he used the fact God's presence was in him to then open up to one of the other people in that group. Being God's presence wherever we are. You know, it's a personal thing, it's not changeable. It's not as if it's like a piece of furniture that sits in the corner of the room, sits in the corner of our lives, and we just use it whenever it's appropriate. It should be part of all the fabric of our lives, intertwined into every part of it. But as we've already heard this morning, life throws its challenges and difficulties. You know, when everything's falling apart, do we, just like Chris and Marion were sharing, do we hold on to the fact that God's presence is with us in wherever our situation is? Does it fill your life and give you that peace, knowing that God's presence is there? Yes, challenges are there. Challenges will always be there. For some people, sadly, they get a lot worse than others. But hold on to the fact that God's presence is with you. Psalm 139, verses 7 to 10 says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast." That psalm talks about the fact that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-present. No matter what we go through, wherever we're at, God's presence is there. And in the indescribable act of love and mercy, Jesus redefined the word temple and added a whole new dimension to us being able to experience His presence. It's personal now. So let's each develop that deeper presence with God, so that we can demonstrate to others how that's changed our life and what that presence means to each one of us. Perhaps if the band can just come up now. Before we sing, I just want to, I really had that sense, as we were praying through there earlier, I just really had that sense that there's some of you here this morning who know God's presence is here in your head, but actually it just needs to be part of your whole life. Know within your heart that actually God's presence is there. Maybe you are facing significant challenges at the moment. Maybe understandably you're fearful of the time coming out of the time we've been through and uncertain of the days ahead. Whatever it is, I think we just need to be quiet for a moment, just reflect on what God may be saying to us and reassuring us, just like the words of that psalm, that He is there with us. Wherever we are, He is there with us at all times. Hold on to that. Experience His peace. Sometimes many times we pray for people when they're in situations. I think of Steve Allman at the moment. I wasn't planning on saying this, but I think of Steve Allman. Most of you know he's in hospital at the moment. He's having a terrible time. And he's got so many complications in his life. And Sue and I, we pray for him. We get to the point of not knowing, apart from God to intervene for a pure miracle in his life, we just pray that God's presence will be with him. Because there's nothing else I can pray. You know, he's in a seemingly helpless situation. And you may be in that situation, you may know of many other people in that situation. But I just have a sense this morning, we all just need to just be quiet and allow God to speak to us and to be immersed once again by His presence. So let's just do that for a moment before we sing. Lord, overwhelm us with your presence. Fill into those parts of our lives maybe that we're just struggling with and we're perhaps just pushing to one side and not allowing you to be part of. Maybe there's situations which are really concerning us and disturbing us. Lord, flood us with your love, with your peace. Maybe there's someone here who knows they have and they know your presence in them, but actually they're not showing that outside of their own personal life, and they perhaps feel challenged. They need to go and tell a neighbour, a friend, a work colleague. Lord, give us courage to pour out your presence into those around. Thank you, Lord. Let's finish with this song which does echo the words. This song is taken the words of that Psalm 139. In every moment you are there, watching over, you hear my prayer. You go before me, you're behind me. Nothing's hidden from you. God of strength, your hand is on my life, bringing peace to me. You know my frame, you know how I am made. You planned all my days. Hand of mercy, hand of love, giving power to overcome. If all else beneath me falls away, I know that you are God. Let's stand together as we sing.